The morning sun painted Crestwood in soft golden hues. Outside a small cafe, the world bustled with life as customers enjoyed their coffee. At a corner table sat Ethan Reed, a blind man with a quiet demeanor. By his side was Atlas, his steadfast German shepherd, standing tall and vigilant. Atlas wasn't just any dog. Once a trained K-9 officer, he had transitioned from protecting the streets to guiding Ethan. For Ethan, Atlas was more than a guide. He was a lifeline, a silent companion in the darkness. As Ethan sipped his coffee, the hum of motorcycles broke the tranquility. 3 riders roared into view, parking near the cafe. Dressed in leather jackets adorned with bold patches, they exuded confidence tinged with menace. The leader, a man named Riker, had a commanding presence, his loud laughter drawing attention. Atlas's ears perked up, sensing the shift in atmosphere. His posture changed subtly, a silent acknowledgement of potential danger. Riker approached, his gaze fixed on the imposing German shepherd. "That's a big dog you've got," he said with a smirk, his tone probing. Ethan smiled faintly. "Atlas keeps me safe," he replied. Riker leaned closer, his grin widening. "Safe, huh? Let's see how smart he really is." He reached out to touch Atlas, a move that triggered a low growl. Atlas stood his ground, eyes locked on Riker, who chuckled nervously but didn't back off. Ethan's calm voice broke through the tension. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his hand brushing Atlas's neck. The growl softened, but Atlas remained alert. The cafe's lively chatter had turned into murmurs as onlookers sensed the brewing conflict. Riker took a step back, laughing to mask his discomfort. But the tension lingered, palpable in the crisp morning air. Ethan, oblivious to the full weight of the scene, finished his coffee and prepared to leave. Atlas close by his side. Unseen by Ethan, Riker's eyes followed them as they walked away, a spark of defiance flickering in his gaze. The walk back to Ethan's modest apartment was uneventful, but something felt off. The morning's tension lingered in the air, settling uneasily in Ethan's chest. Atlas's behavior didn't help. The dog was unusually alert, his ears twitching at every sound, his steps careful and measured. Inside the apartment, Ethan unclipped Atlas's leash and sighed. "What's going on, boy?" he murmured, rubbing the dog's head. Atlas roamed the small space, sniffing corners and standing guard near the door. Ethan could hear his paws pacing the hardwood floor. Ethan settled into his favorite chair, trying to shake off his unease. Memories of the cafe replayed in his mind. The strange tone in Riker's voice, the weight of Atlas's growl. Ethan trusted Atlas completely, and the dog's reaction left him unsettled. As the day turned into evening, a sense of calm returned, though it felt fragile. Ethan prepared a simple dinner, the sounds of chopping and boiling filling the quiet apartment. Atlas sat by the door, still watchful, his gaze fixed on the street outside. "Still on edge, huh?" Ethan said, setting down a bowl of water for Atlas. The dog lapped at it briefly before returning to his post. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the distant hum of motorcycle engines. Ethan didn't hear it, but Atlas did. The dog's ears shot up and he let out a low growl, his body stiffening as he moved closer to the window. Ethan paused, sensing the change in Atlas's demeanor. "What is it, Atlas?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but concerned. He placed a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the tension ripple beneath the fur. The engines grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Atlas let out a sharp bark, startling Ethan. Someone knocked on the door. 3 deliberate raps that echoed in the stillness of the apartment. Ethan's heart raced. "Who is it?" He called out, gripping Atlas's leash tightly. A familiar voice responded, rough and mocking. "Relax, it's just me, Riker." Ethan froze. His grip on the leash tightened as Atlas stepped between him and the door, growling low and steady. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice firm. "What do you want?" The pause on the other side was too long. "Just a friendly chat," Riker said, his tone dripping with insincerity. Ethan didn't reply, but his instincts and Atlas's warning growls told him the same thing. This was far from friendly. The silence that followed Riker's words pressed down like a heavy fog. Atlas growled again, a deep, menacing sound that seemed to reverberate through the small apartment. Ethan's hand tightened on the dog's leash, his pulse quickening. "Look, man," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling. Just leave." But Riker didn't leave. Instead, the sound of faint whispers and muffled laughter outside the door grew louder. Ethan's unease deepened. He could sense something brewing, something Atlas had already detected. "Come on, Ethan," Riker called out, his tone shifting to mockery. "We're just having a little fun. Why don't you open the door?" Ethan's grip on the leash was white-knuckled now. "I said leave. I'm not opening the door." Outside, the laughter subsided, replaced by a sharp metallic scrape. It came from the side of the apartment, near the window. Atlas barked sharply, his body rigid as he turned toward the sound. Ethan's chest tightened with dread. "Atlas, stay," Ethan commanded, his voice low. He fumbled for his phone on the counter, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher's calm voice answered, but Ethan's words spilled out in a rush. "There's someone outside my apartment," he said, his voice shaking. "They're trying to scare me, or worse." The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, but the minutes stretched like hours. Outside, Riker's voice rose again, this time closer to the window. "Nice dog you've got there, Ethan. Let's see if he's as tough as he looks." The scraping sound turned into a thud, followed by the sharp clatter of something hitting the ground. Atlas barked again, louder this time. His body coiled like a spring. Ethan backed away from the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound of retreating footsteps came next, hurried and chaotic, then silence. Atlas stood firm, his ears twitching as he listened for more. Ethan stayed frozen, the phone still in his hand, until the distant wail of sirens broke through the oppressive quiet. Moments later, a knock came, this time firm and purposeful. "Police," a voice called out. Ethan exhaled shakily, relief washing over him as he unlocked the door. Atlas didn't relax, though. His sharp eyes stayed fixed on the shadows outside, as if warning Ethan that this was far from over. The night in Crestwood deepened into an eerie stillness, the kind that made every sound seem louder and every shadow more sinister. Ethan sat on the couch, Atlas resting at his feet. The apartment was quiet, but not peaceful. Atlas's tense posture was a constant reminder of the day's earlier events. Ethan couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. His fingers brushed through Atlas's fur absent-mindedly. "You're still on edge, aren't you, buddy?" he murmured. Atlas didn't respond the way he normally would. No reassuring wag of the tail, no playful nuzzle. Instead, his ears twitched, his sharp eyes fixed on the front door. Ethan leaned back, trying to convince himself he was imagining things. But then, the faint rumble of motorcycles shattered the silence. Ethan couldn't hear it, but Atlas could. The dog shot to his feet, his body stiffening, his eyes narrowing in the direction of the door. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice tightening with concern. He reached down, feeling the tension ripple through Atlas's frame. The growl grew deeper as the sound of the engines grew louder, eventually stopping nearby. Ethan felt Atlas move closer to the door, his paws steady on the floor as he sniffed the air. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the apartment. Ethan froze. His heart quickened as his grip tightened on Atlas's leash. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice steady but edged with fear. A familiar voice responded, low and mocking. "Relax, Ethan. It's just me, Riker." Ethan's breath caught. His mind raced, weighing his options. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice firmer now. Riker chuckled from the other side of the door. "Just came by to talk, that's all. No need to get your dog all riled up." Ethan didn't trust the casual tone. Atlas growled louder, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the door as if he could see through it. "Leave now," Ethan said, his voice cold and commanding. But Riker didn't leave. Instead, muffled whispers and faint laughter came from outside, sending a chill down Ethan's spine. Atlas barked sharply, cutting through the tension. Ethan reached for his phone, his trembling fingers fumbling to dial 911. He didn't know what Riker and his friends wanted, but Atlas's instincts were clear. This was far from over. The silence that followed Riker's taunting laughter was oppressive, broken only by Atlas's sharp bark and the muffled shuffling of footsteps outside. Ethan gripped the dog's leash tightly, his mind racing. The tension in the air felt like a taut wire about to snap. Atlas moved closer to the door, his body rigid, a low growl vibrating through his chest. "Stay back, Atlas," Ethan murmured, though he knew the command was more for himself than the dog. His other hand fumbled for his phone. The dispatcher's voice echoed in his ear as he explained the situation, his words spilling out in a rush. "There are people outside my apartment," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "They've been harassing me all day. They're trying to scare me." "Stay inside, sir," the dispatcher replied calmly. "Officers are on their way." Ethan lowered the phone, his hand brushing through Atlas's fur for comfort. "Help is coming," he whispered. But Atlas's growls didn't waver. The dog remained focused, his sharp eyes locked on the door. Then came the sound of glass shattering. Ethan flinched as something heavy hit the ground outside the apartment. The smell of smoke wafted through the window, sharp and acrid. Atlas barked furiously, his paws clawing at the floor as if ready to lunge at the unseen threat. "Fire!" a voice shouted from the street. The sound of commotion grew as neighbors stirred, their voices cutting through the still night. Ethan's heart pounded as the heat from the flames grew closer. "Riker!" Ethan shouted toward the door, his voice filled with both fear and anger. "Leave now. You've crossed the line." Laughter answered him, distant but deliberate. "You think that mutt's gonna save you?" Riker's voice sneered from somewhere beyond the flames. "This isn't over, Ethan." The distant wail of sirens cut through the chaos, growing louder with every second. The noise outside shifted, hurried footsteps, panicked whispers. The smell of smoke began to fade as neighbors doused the flames with buckets of water. Atlas barked again, louder this time, his body vibrating with tension. Ethan gripped the leash tighter, his voice low and firm. "We'll get through this, Atlas," he said, though his words were as much for himself as the dog. "We always do." The wail of sirens drew closer, their sharp notes slicing through the chaos outside. Ethan remained crouched beside Atlas, his heart pounding in his chest. The smoke from the fire was dissipating, but the tension in the air lingered, thick and suffocating. Atlas stood firm by the door, his sharp eyes locked on the faint flickers of movement beyond the window. His growls had quieted, but his body remained taut, ready to spring into action. Ethan reached out, his hand steadying on the dog's harness. "Stay with me, Atlas," he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm him. The knock on the door that followed was strong and deliberate. "Police," a voice called out, firm but calm. Ethan exhaled sharply and stood, pulling Atlas back slightly before unlocking the door. Two officers stood on the other side, their faces serious but reassuring. "Mr. Reed, are you all right?" one of them asked. Ethan nodded, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "They're gone," he said. "But they started a fire. They said this wasn't over." The officer's expression darkened. "We saw the damage outside. Your neighbors helped put the fire out before it spread." "Can you describe the people who did this?" Ethan shook his head, his grip tightening on Atlas's leash. "I didn't see them, but it's the same men from earlier. The leader, his name's Riker." The second officer crouched down, reaching out cautiously toward Atlas. The dog remained alert, his gaze fixed on the shadows outside. "Your dog's instincts are impressive," the officer said, his voice low. "He seems to know there's still danger." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "He's always been like that. Atlas, he knows. The officers reassured Ethan that they would patrol the area through the night and urged him to consider staying somewhere else. "People like Riker thrive on fear," one of them said. "But he's escalating. You should be cautious." Ethan hesitated, his hand brushing against Atlas's fur. "This is my home," he said firmly. "I'm not leaving because of him." As the officers stepped back outside to continue their investigation, Ethan closed the door and locked it, leaning heavily against it. Atlas moved closer, pressing against his side. His presence a steady reminder of strength and protection. Ethan knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around the dog's sturdy frame. "We're not running, Atlas," he murmured, "but we'll be ready for whatever comes next." Atlas licked his face softly, his sharp eyes still scanning the room. Ethan could feel the dog's steady heartbeat against him, a rhythm of unwavering loyalty. Outside, the sirens faded into the distance, leaving the apartment heavy with silence. But both Ethan and Atlas knew the fight was far from over. The night stretched long and heavy, the echoes of sirens and the distant hum of commotion fading into uneasy quiet. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his head bowed, his hands resting on Atlas's strong shoulders. The loyal dog sat at his feet, his body a wall of vigilance and strength. The air in the apartment felt heavier than before, the lingering smell of smoke mixing with the quiet dread that settled over them. Ethan's thoughts swirled, trying to piece together what might come next. He had never felt this exposed, this vulnerable. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered to Atlas, running his hand over the dog's fur. "You felt it before I did." "You always do." Atlas gave a slight wag of his tail but didn't shift his focus. His ears twitched, his sharp eyes darting toward the door at every faint creak or whisper of movement. The tension in his frame was unshakable, his instincts as a protector fully engaged. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind replaying the day's events. Riker's taunts, the fire, the breaking glass, it all pointed to one thing. This wasn't over. He knew Riker would return, but he also knew he couldn't live in fear. The faint sound of footsteps outside the building pulled Atlas to his feet, his posture stiffening. Ethan tensed, placing a hand on the dog's harness. "It's okay, Atlas," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The steps moved past, fading into the distance. Still, Atlas didn't relax. He circled the room once, sniffing the air before settling near the door, his body coiled and ready. Ethan leaned back against the wall, exhaustion tugging at him. "We'll be ready," he murmured, his voice low but resolute. "No matter what, we'll face it together." The hours ticked by, the silence in the apartment broken only by the soft sound of Atlas's breathing and the occasional distant rumble of a motorcycle. Finally, as dawn began to creep into the sky, Ethan allowed himself to drift into a restless sleep. Atlas, ever vigilant, remained at his post by the door. His sharp eyes never wavered, his body poised to defend the man who depended on him. As the first rays of sunlight painted the walls of the small apartment, one thing was clear. Ethan and Atlas would not be broken. Their bond was stronger than any fear, and together they would face whatever came next. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.